This is meeting number 60 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. With regard to interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece or select the desired channel. And a reminder that all comments have to be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can and appreciate your patience. Please also note that during the meeting it is not permitted to take pictures in the room or screenshots on Zoom. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me and we will suspend the meeting in order to ensure that everyone has proper interpretation. Pursuant to the Standing Order of 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Friday, November the 25th, 2022, the committee is beginning its study of non-tariff barriers in Canada's existing and potential international trade agreements. We have with us today by video conference for the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, Flavio Volpe. For the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart True, Senior Researcher. And from Mondo Foods Company Limited, Tom Dinardi, President. And for the Organization of Women in International Trade, Natalie Bradbury, President of the Organization for Women in International Trade. So welcome to all of you. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with a round of questions. Mr. Volpe, I invite you to have an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you again. And thank you for the committee for inviting me to this August panel to talk about something that is, from time to time, the biggest issue in trade for our industry with other countries. I'm going to frame my remarks with our relationship with a commercial and a diplomatic relationship with Japan, because I think it's illustrative of where some of the non-tariff barriers play in a real practical manner in the auto sector, where we can ground a couple of examples. But I think I want you to keep in mind countries like Vietnam, who are now our CPTPP partners, who are emerging players in the auto sector. And anybody who's been to the Yorkdale Mall in Toronto can see that you can buy a VinFast, a Vietnamese produced, engineered, supplied vehicle for sale, a very competitive product for sale to Canadian consumers. Well, we spent a lot of time with this government and the previous government updating, renewing, starting new trade relationships, formal trade agreements with great existing trade partners like Japan. During the TPP discussion and negotiation that started with the former government and finished with the current government, one of the things that we were seized with was how to deal with our Japanese partners' global leading automotive products and the local demand here. How to properly work out an agreement that is accretive to both to operations in both countries, but also how to balance a scenario where Canada does not have a domestic automaker, does not make decisions on product allocation and design like even the Vietnamese do, but specifically how Toyota and Honda, who manufacture vehicles here, sell vehicles here. Some of the vehicles they manufacture, they sell here. And some of the vehicles that they sell here, they manufacture in other parts of the world, especially including Japan. We tend to start these negotiations or to conduct these negotiations as if we're equal partners in at least on the automotive space, and we're not. We're the world's 10th biggest automotive jurisdiction by units of production, but we have not had a sustainable Canadian car company since for 100 years. Malcolm Bricklin gave it a shot in the 70s and it didn't work. Draw attention to the fact that different countries have different vehicle import penetration that are starkly different in Canada. In Canada, 85% of the vehicles sold in Canada have foreign origins. In Japan, that number was 6.9%. This is a 2017 number when we started the TPP negotiations. We talked with both governments, the previous one and the current one, about some of the reasons are the non-tariff barriers in Japan. They take the form of ownership taxes. For example, Japan charges private vehicle owners 3 annual taxes for vehicle use paid at registration time. Automobile tax, which is on the dimensions, automobile weight tax, and on the road tax. They're all charged on a sliding scale, and the first 2 by vehicle weight and size, and the third by engine displacement. A Canadian car, we use this example then, made in Brampton on the Stellantis Dodge and Chrysler line, the LX cars that we all know, the Chargers, Challengers, and 300s, would have had those 3 taxes would have totaled 105,000 yen at the time. A Japanese domestic market Nissan Maxima with a base engine would annually cost the Japanese customer about 79,000 yen. And for this for that comparison that we used for similar product into that market, the annual ownership difference was the equivalent of about $1,500 to $2,300 Canadian. On the fuel side, there's fuel costs in Japan are 40 cents a liter higher, and a lot of that is in taxes. 52% of that difference is in taxes. This adds a disproportionate cost for less fuel efficient vehicles that we manufacture here for the North American market. And in using the regular Transport Canada duty cycle of 24,000 kilometers a year at $1.60 a liter of gas, the difference in operating a Canadian-made vehicle from Brampton and a Nissan Maxima there was somewhere between $989 and $1,200 in incremental tax. This is the ownership price difference. There are no distribution dealerships for Canadian cars in countries like Japan. There are Japanese car companies that operate dealerships here. The cost of importing a vehicle would be borne by the consumer. It makes it price prohibitive for a consumer in Japan to buy a vehicle made in Canada. But we signed up to do a free trade agreement to the CPTPP that said, well, one of the advantages, we're going to open the great Japanese market versus in the same way we open up the Canadian market. But we're not organized the same from an industrial point of view. We don't have Canadian domicile companies. And then the Japanese non-tariff barriers in the form of taxes, both for the ownership and on gas taxes, makes it prohibitive. It is the bigger barrier than anything else in terms of customer preference. We're going to continue to do these trade agreements. We're going to continue. Vietnam is inside the CPTPP. We're going to have the similar challenges with an imbalance in trade between them and us on those vehicles. Same thing with Europe and CETA. And I hope that we take a deeper look the next time we reopen or start a trade negotiation with another car-making country, so as to see how else other barriers for consumer entry than just, hey, by the way, what we usually say, well, if you're competitive, you can sell here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from committee members. Yes, on to Mr. True, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much to the Chair and the committee for the invitation to be here. To be honest, I wasn't exactly sure how to frame my presentation on the topic of non-tariff barriers. It seemed to me quite a broad category. I thought maybe given the high profile of certain food issues around non-tariff barriers, that would be the focus. But, from looking at the group you have here, it's more eclectic and more varied than that. So I decided to keep it kind of big picture and just mention 3 things I think it's important to keep in mind in any discussion about non-tariff barriers. So the first is that what one group, whether, say, a producer group or maybe a trade economist, for example, what one group considers a non-tariff barrier, other groups might call simply good public policy, right? And I'll give you a few examples. Front of package health labeling, for example, on cigarettes, alcohol, or food maybe talking about the sugar or fat content, for example, that apply to domestic as well as international companies. You could have labels that have to do with other reasons as well, like halal labeling in Indonesia, for example. That's come up as both a technical barrier to trade and as in that country in particular, say, a good public policy. You know, another example, California's animal welfare laws expanding minimum cage and pen sizes for captive farm animals and banning the sale of food products, even from out of state that can't meet those standards. There's policies aimed at reducing the use of pesticides, for example, or favoring organics based on environmental considerations or the preferences of a given local, national, or perhaps regional population in the case of the European Union. And maybe public stockholding, and there's tons of other examples, but public stockholding programs in, say, India that aim to stabilize prices and compensate struggling farmers. So all of these are clear cases of public health, they serve public health, public ethics, social or environmental purposes, but they may also be challenged in trade deals with overly strict rules on how governments are allowed to regulate. The second point I'll make is that existing trade deals, I think, go far enough and probably too far to limit regulatory and policy space in ways that impoverish our democracy and the democracies in other countries. Canada and the U.S. are among a relatively small group of countries at the WTO who continue to expand disciplines on government regulatory space in their bilateral and regional trade agreements. I think the CUSMA is the most striking example of this, and I can share some of the research I've done previous on some of the ways that that's true, if the committee is interested. The agreement goes further, for example, than most trade deals to kind of privilege the interests of foreign investors and foreign companies in the domestic rulemaking process. And it enshrines in international law a single, allegedly best way to regulate in all instances in what they call a good regulatory practice chapter, which is open to dispute settlement in that agreement. The amount of work that Canadian regulators now already do to ensure public protections comply with our trade obligations, comply with things like Red Tape Reduction Act rules and regulatory burden assessments, that's been described by different groups as creating red tape for regulators. It actually gets in the way of governments doing their job in some cases, which is regulating to protect public interests. That job, I would say, is complicated enough by today's overlapping and very serious environmental and social problems. And in some areas like fossil fuel emissions or biodiversity loss or online privacy, for example, I think governments are under pressure to do more to restrict trade and to actually create what might be considered as trade barriers or technical barriers to trade, and for good reasons, to rapidly lower greenhouse gas emissions, to protect, again, public privacy by limiting cross-border flows of data, for example. These are all examples, again, of where public policy could be framed one way or the other. The final thing I'll say is that I believe there are already appropriate venues exist in Canada's WTO, at the WTO, excuse me, and in our bilateral agreements for addressing differences with other countries with respect to technical barriers to trade, food standards, and other policies. The notice system at the WTO is actually quite effective at diffusing problems before they end up before a dispute settlement panel. And, you know, where we have bilateral commitments and committees established to look at specific issues, as in CETA, it's not obviously what a lot of producers groups would say is a perfect solution, but I would say it's one that strikes a good balance between the democratic obligations of governments to their people and varied interests in how they develop policy on the one hand, and the trade interests of limited groups on the other. So I'll just conclude there to say that I think this is a possibly huge area of study for the committee, and I wish you good luck in grappling with it. I think it's an important area as well because it cuts to the heart of what our trade agreements do and what they could be doing better in this era as we grapple with these very big problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, for example. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chu. On to Mr. Dinardi, please, for up to 5.
My name is Tom Dinardi, family member of a second-generation food business that I hope to pass on to my children one day. My 80-year-old parents still come to work every day to make sure their legacy continues. For 50 years, our family has been importing, retailing, wholesaling, and distributing domestic and imported cheese to pizzerias, restaurants, and retailers, both local and nationally. In fact, perhaps some of the products you buy at your grocer may have been pioneered, developed, imported, and distributed by Mondo Foods. We have grown from a 600-square-foot Italian deli in Winnipeg's ethnic West End to a medium-sized business today. This is through hard work and dedication to family, staff, and customers. It's been a long road. It's been a tough road. Multiple times over the years, we have pioneered and built specialty cheese programs for major retailers worth millions of dollars, only to be cut out by the quota holder. Until CETA, CUSMA, and TTP, the only way to import cheese into Canada was to own or rent quota from a historical WTO quota holder. A small amount of WTO quota was reallocated to us in the late 90s as a result of the Canadian Trade Tribunal report. This allowed us to pioneer new, exciting specialty cheeses to our customers. We were finally in control of our own destiny. In fact, we further developed the specialty cheese market by acquiring other WTO quota holders' licenses. But once again, we became a victim of our own success, developing an imported cracker-cut cheese tray never seen in Canada before, which unfortunately we had to stop selling as sales demand had far exceeded quota availability, costing us millions. CETA was rolled out with a 4-pool program from 2017 to 22, which saw increased access to the Canadian market from 15 to 30 million kilos. We thought this was the beginning of a more level playing field for companies like ours, a small and large pool for manufacturers and the same for retailers and distributors, with 60% going to the small and medium enterprises and 40% going to the large enterprises. The threshold for manufacturers is approximately 50 million litres and approximately 1 million kilos of cheese sales for retailers and distributors annually. It is worth noting that under the supply management system, there are potentially thousands of distributors and retailers, but practically under 100 manufacturers. In 2017, Mondo received its first CETA allocation, which grew to 120 tons in 2020. It used this allocation to import and develop a specialty cheese program with major retailers. The program grew, and we were comfortable in thinking that we had a stable 100-ton plus or minus supply of CETA, as our sales volume had not changed since 2020. It never occurred to us that the threshold would slide backwards to 475,000 kilos from 1 million kilos in 5 years. In 2021, we were devastated to find out that we would be competing with the likes of Loblaws and Cisco for quota in the large pool and received only 5,800 kilos from 120,000 kilos just the year before. Just think about that for a second. This put our family business in extreme peril, and all the hard work had evaporated. We sounded the alarm bells to Global Affairs and had several conversations and assurances that we understand the effects on companies like yours, and there are several. And this is a result of unintended consequences of the formula, and that there was a comprehensive review to address it. Follow-up emails and meetings with the Deputy Director was summed up in the following email to him on September 13th, 2022. In conclusion of our meeting, Mondo is hoping to get a timely resolution to the unintended consequences of the mathematical formula that currently governs the small and large pool distributors and retailers. Some of the key points were discussed: thresholds that better reflect established on the outset of CETA, greater transparency of thresholds so companies are not blindsided from 1 year to the next being put into the large pool, that reasonable continuity of quota amounts from 1 year to the next is crucial to a company's contractual commitments and to continued viability, that it is unfair and devastating for companies like ours to be given quota to build our business and then be penalized for maintaining and growing. It's not just the economic cost, it's the damage to the company's goodwill. The current systems that created a market of armchair traders that increased the price to consumers, causing inflation and market instability. We feel no further ahead than at the beginning, beholden to armchair traders making millions of dollars for doing nothing on our work. Just this year, we lost a 30-year customer for the value of the quota that I had to pay, and a manufacturer was gifted by Global Affairs from a WTO reallocation, a reallocation of 250 tons that I was not entitled to. We are not sure where the equity and equality is about that. CETA is not the only area of which there are problems. Both CUSMA and TTP are being challenged by the United States and New Zealand. We have problems with this system. Thank you.
It's not good things to hear. Can we go on to Mr. Bradbury, please? Ms. Bradbury.
Hello, my name is Natalie Bradbury. I'm representing the Ottawa and Toronto chapters of OIT, the Organization of Women in International Trade. I am the president of OIT Ottawa and a former trade commissioner, economist, and policy officer in various parts of the Canadian Public Service, including global affairs, agriculture, immigration, and heritage. The Organization of Women in International Trade, or OIT, is a global not-for-profit association with over 20 years in business, I guess, seeking to advance women's role in international trade and business. With 2,500 members and over 25 chapters active in North, Central, and South America, Europe, and Africa, OIT members are professionals engaged in all aspects of international trade. Together, our members make a significant contribution to global economic growth. At OIT Ottawa and OIT Toronto, we provide mentoring, networking, and educational events, as well as trade missions. We have corporate members, including Export Development Corp Canada, and from the private and academic sectors, as well as individual members who tend to be professionals in the legal and financial sectors, academics, public sector, as well as from large and small corporations. Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving us the opportunity to speak about NTBs and Canada's current and potential FTAs. Vous pouvez m'adresser en français si vous voulez.
You can speak to me in French if you wish.
These are, as Stuart said, NTBs are a huge area of study, and they are complicated and detailed, and yes, they have a good side and they have a bad side. So it's hard to really assess them broadly since they have a different impact. I had different stories to say than either of my colleagues here, but in the interest of time, I'll pass on to that. So how do these pertain to women in trade? Canadian studies show that women-owned businesses tend to be smaller, they have less employees, and have more trouble with access to finance than those owned by men. Can export grants, for example, have high thresholds for applications, which can work against service-based businesses, which a lot of women hold, and the application process is onerous. Besides service businesses, Canadian women entrepreneurs are very active in retail, buying and selling to international markets, an area with many technical trade regulations, which is NTBs. These kinds of challenges of women-owned businesses are similar with our trading partners as well, in fact, worldwide. The 2022 State of Women Entrepreneurship in Canada, released on International Women's Day in March, found that only 18% of Canadian companies are owned by women, up from 16% 2 years earlier. Some small progress, but very small. Many women-owned businesses are not incorporated, so they aren't counted in the statistics, or even then they are sole proprietorships, which are another definition again. Women-owned businesses congregate around the small end of the business spectrum, and many business services are designed for the larger incorporated businesses run by men. This, however, is slowly changing. The business world is adapting. What are some of the implications of NTBs for women? Complexity of rules of origin, heavy use of legal jargon in the wording of rules, as well as the complications of tariff classification for certain types of products, make it difficult for businesses, and in particular SMEs, to leverage free trade agreements because they are there, foreign suppliers can't understand the eligibility rules. Importers are often obliged to rely on their suppliers to provide certifications of origin and have limited ability to conduct due diligence on the production process because of commercial confidentiality concerns, even though the duty liability is borne by the importer. This creates risk for the importer. Here I'm talking clearly about small business. I speak about women-owned businesses, which is where most Canadian women-owned businesses are located. Variations in rules of origin across different free trade agreements has created a spaghetti bowl of different rules that makes compliance and record-keeping difficult and costly for companies, especially ones which have a small number of staff. Health and environmental policy, trade and restrictions, we all agree, have positive aspects from one perspective, but also some negative, and there's always trade complaints in the courts dealing with those, trying to sort through those issues. I participated in a recent event organized by the British Chambers of Commerce of Canada, Ecuador, and Chile, where OIT UK and OIT Ottawa were present. According to Simonetta Zarilli at UNCTAD, for many decades it was felt that trade and gender had nothing to do with each other. Customs, procedures, duties, tariffs are the same whoever is doing the importing and export, right? However, what is different is the impact of these rules and procedures on women and men, since they play different roles in society and the economy. Firstly, women are employees. With trade liberalization and the switch to export orientation of many developing countries, large numbers of women were hired to work in these sectors, such as textiles, clothing, shoes, and later in the high-tech factories from microchips, cell phones, iPhones, you name it. But the best jobs, the high-paying jobs, the factory managers, the trading professionals, were held by men. This might remind you of the situation of the C-suites in Canada, where not enough women.
You could just, your closing remark, Ms. Bradbury.
Thank you. Women are entrepreneurs. I've already spoken of some of the issues there. So liberalization provides opportunities to export, but can be a double-edged sword for families. But FTA negotiations, my conclusion is, can lead to progressive policies being implemented in the broader government policy framework. In Canada, Canada-wide low-cost childcare, and with our lead in Quebec, has greatly improved the situation for women and their families. And now Quebec is the world leader in women employed who are mothers with children under the age of 3. Thank you very much.
Ms. Bradbury. Okay, on for 6 minutes, Mr. Martel, please.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the witnesses who are here today. It's interesting. I would like to speak to Mr. Dinardi. Mr. Dinardi, can you hear me? Yes? Just a moment, please. It's interesting because we hear about trade and all these issues, but when these are carried out, this trade, we realize that there are failures and things are to the disadvantage of Canadian markets. I looked at processors in the dairy market. I talked a lot about the reciprocity of standards, and it's not the same thing. There are products that come in here, and then there are other products that we can't have accepted elsewhere because the standards aren't the same. So you're talking about quotas, and I'm asking about the consultations. I'm listening to you speak, and I was also listening to the person talking about cars in Japan. We're just often disadvantaged during these negotiations, and I wonder what you think of that.
Could you please repeat the question? So I'd like to give you a clear and decisive answer. And I'm sorry, it's probably the translation I'm not getting.
Oui,
and
okay.
my apologies, my French is not that good. So.
Yeah, okay.
We'll give you and repeat the question, Mr.
Ouais.
Martel, so that you
Je vais essayer d'aller plus
can answer
rapidement.
effectively.
I'll try to go more quickly. It's that with these commercial agreements, very often we seem disadvantaged. Canada seems to be disadvantaged compared to other markets. So I'm looking at dairy producers and processors, and it seems that after certain agreements, trade agreements were signed, we're told that the reciprocity is not the same thing from one side and the other. The standards are different. Products are brought in from outside the country, but because of the standards in the European countries, so the Europeans are easily bringing their products here, but we're often told that with quotas, we're squeezed by them. So I'd like to know what's going during these negotiations. Are the people here consulted? Because I'm listening to you, and you seem to be greatly disadvantaged.
Mr. Martel, no, I can't speak to the negotiations between Global Affairs and their European counterparts. What I can tell you is that we do have access in this country for about 30 million kilos of EU product, most of which comes as specialty cheeses, but there are some commodity-based products. They are supposed to have whatever access they have. That's the access that they have to our market. I'm not sure what access we have to their market, what we gave up for it in pork or whatnot. The consultations, at the end of the day, I think you might be drilling down to the fact that the most advantaged sector are the dairy manufacturers, the big processors. They're the ones who get the most license, and they're the ones who control most of the import cheese quota in this country, whether it's CETA, 50% of the 15 million kilos, whether it's the CUSMA, almost 100%, because that one actually broke. It was an 80-20 rule, sir, where 80% went to the processors and 20% came to the distributors. And what ended up happening is the U.S. challenged that. And then the Global Affairs say, okay, you know what, we'll have it your way. So instead of some of it coming to, in the spirit of the agreement, to distributors to deal with the breadth and depth of the manufacturers in the U.S., like many of the small manufacturers, they said, no, have it your way, and they actually removed the 20%, and now it says the more you sell, the more you get. For example, sir, I got 10,000 kilos of butter from the U.S. and about 13,000 kilos of cheese, which I used to buy from many small producers in the United States. After Canada dug its heels in its ruling, I now have 900 kilos of butter, and I have about 2,000 kilos of specialty cheese to bring in. The Canadian manufacturers, I'll tell you, sir, they have plants in the U.S., and what they'll end up doing is they'll end up bringing their commodity-based products from the U.S. into their Canadian plants with all of that CUSMA license. And their product cost is half, and guess what? They get to sell it for the same price in Canada. So you tell me if that's the spirit of the agreement. So, of course, our trading partners are up in arms, and I would say, you, sir, the same is with TTP, but CUSMA is the best example. And the United States are challenging that one more time. I hope I've answered your question. I don't know if I understood it correctly.
Ouais. Ouais, mais
Yes, thank you. Thank you, in detail. I also wanted to speak to Mr. Volpe, and it was interesting. You were talking about vehicles, and you're saying that in Japan and in Canada it's different. In Japan there are taxes. So once again, there are negotiations that have occurred, that have happened, and how can I put this? There are details. It's as though Japan feels it's not really in their interest to have those cars because there are taxes. So it seems as though the details aren't all there when we see that these agreements have been hammered out. Mr. Volpe, what do you think of that?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
It's the information is there. I think specifically on the TPP initial negotiation, I think it was a decision of the negotiating team, the government at the time, that there were other priorities than protecting vehicle access in exchange for gains in other sectors. And I think that was also with the government that closed it. I think what's really important to understand is while we agreed to disagree with the government on what the threat was from Japan, because we also had the Japanese investment here, the Toyota and Honda were extremely invested in the Canadian market, making 1 million cars a year, half of our production. So there were some advantages there and kind of balanced things off. We included in the CPTPP Vietnam, who at the time the government dismissed, said, well, Vietnam and Malaysia, for example, were just part suppliers like Canada was. So there is a balance with Japan. Don't worry about the Vietnamese threat. Well, here we are now, 5 years later, and the Vietnamese make cars and they import them to Canada tariff-free, in part because of the deal that we signed that didn't see the any other emerging threat or consider it to be pejorative for the market share by Canadian producers. VinFast makes great vehicles, and they're competitive and they look good. I mean, they're designed by Pininfarina, Ferrari's designer. They're priced competitively against the market leader in Tesla. They're sold past distributor agreements directly at places like shopping centers in Toronto. And I think as we look at the CPTPP, when we get a chance to review it, I think the first thing that I would look at is the balance of cars made in Canada sold in Japan. I'll tell you that there will be none, 300-400 versus maybe 150,000 here. And then take a look at the new Vietnamese threat. There'll be zero going from Canada to Vietnam, and there'll be a good cohort of cars sold by VinFast here. And I think that should be a case study lesson for the next time we renegotiate CPTPP or we dismiss other trading partners as potentially emerging to compete with us in one of the most important sectors in this economy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Varani, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you to all of the witnesses, first of all, both here in person and Flavio, it's good to see you online. I wanted to start with Ms. Bradbury, actually. And also thank you for your service as a past trade commissioner. It's a really important service to Canadian entities and what we do on exports around the planet. You had mentioned sort of the empowerment of women generally in the entrepreneurial space, and you talked about some very important programs, and you highlighted Quebec and the childcare program. I'm going to say, obviously, that we're patterning, as you well know, a national program on Quebec's very successful model, and we're hopeful to see the same sort of results replicated in the other 9 provinces and 3 territories around the country. And I want to ask you to comment on that. But as well as commenting on that, if you could comment on one other aspect which you raised, which was this issue about sort of non-tariff trade barriers and how they apply to women who are predominantly small-sized entrepreneurs, and how that dovetails or not with the women's entrepreneurship strategy. So that's a big policy that we've rolled out over the last few years. It's almost as much as $7 billion of investments. It's got several heads, but one of the heads of that investment deals specifically with pursuit of market opportunities abroad, market strategy, promoting business advisory services, etc. Do you have any concrete suggestions about what we need to do with respect to the women's entrepreneurship strategy to empower women entrepreneurs to both export more, but also to overcome non-tariff trade barriers as they exist as impediments? So if you can comment on both of those. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, with regard to the broader government policy framework outside of trade, this is something that, and so the example of childcare, this has been very well noted. Canada is often a world leader on promoting women in trade, but women in the economy. And one of the recent events I was at, OE UK, or actually it was the UK Department of Business and Trade, I think, mentioned that childcare is something they are really pushing forward, and this is coming from a Conservative government. So other countries have understood the importance of national programs such as childcare. They also look at other types of government policies, industry initiatives that can move things forward. So in other countries, gender-based violence is a big issue, and all sorts of issues. So these government policies, it's interesting because foreign trade negotiations, which have a progressive chapter, gender and trade chapter, inclusive trade chapter broadly, often leads to progressive reforms taking place in other parts of the government policy framework, just generally. So that, just a quick overview of that. In terms of NTBs affecting women primarily at the small side of the spectrum, in terms of working with the women entrepreneurship strategy, a key part is trade. There's all sorts of. It's such a wonderful strategy. It covers so much, right? And again, other countries look enviously at Canada and what we've accomplished here. In non-tariff barriers encompasses so many different areas, and one of them is intellectual property, for example. So in that field, for example, there is, in the field of textiles, for example, women in traditional areas, indigenous groups, for example, women are the owners, they are the creators of intellectual property, of the designs, the textile designs, even the genetic resources, medical herbs, that kind of thing, right? And so there's understanding that they need to be helped. And so the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has set up programs to assist women, indigenous groups to assist them to become more entrepreneurial, to understand the value of their intellectual property, to set up training. So WIPO does things for these countries, women in these countries. I don't know to what extent in Canada we assist women owners. I don't know if the Indigenous peoples of Canada can benefit from WIPO. I don't know. I think it's strictly for developing countries, for example, right? So this is an example where maybe developed countries, if they don't have their own strategies, they may be not at a disadvantage, but they can't also benefit. So replicating some of the programs at the UN level. Also, another one would be She Trades, which is another thing which is done, a combination between UNCTAD and the International Trade Center for developing countries to teach women entrepreneurs from these places how to engage and also finding them mentors, teaching them programs, teaching them confidence building, assertiveness training, so that when they're with a bank, that they don't sound like a huge risk because they don't sound as if they believe in their products or in their company, in their strategies, that kind of thing. So working on these things requires a combination of government policies, industry initiatives, support from international organizations. We kind of have to work together to move forward and to help small businesses to then navigate the complex regulatory environments such as in non-tariff barriers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Vignola, please.
Ms. Vignola, welcome to the committee. Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question, in fact, my three questions, will be to Mr. True and Mr. Denardi. So, during the negotiations of CETA, Canada wasn't able to anticipate the impacts of non-tariff barriers in Europe and their impacts on our exports, particularly beef. And I know that I understand that your situation, Mr. Denardi, is particularly difficult at the moment. So how to explain, first the question, that Canada was not able to anticipate those impacts? And secondly, what should we have done to avoid finding ourselves in a situation where the advantages that were promised by these accords simply did not appear because of these non-tariff barriers? And third question, if Canada was seeking to eliminate or reduce those NTBs from the European Union, what should be the priorities?
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question.
As best as I can, I think you raised some very important questions about what were the government's intentions in the negotiations, what was the strategy, was it appropriate, and in the outcome, did we get an outcome that we maybe didn't anticipate? I don't know with respect to beef. I only go from the stories that everyone can see with respect to not Canada's beef producers being disappointed with the access they received. Could we have predicted this going in? I think probably, yeah. I mean, this is one of the longest standing issues Canada has with the European Union, is with respect to the acceptable standards that are adopted, right, in the production of beef here and in the European Union. Again, multiple domestic interests in the European Union, very strong interests, very strong consumer preferences with respect to certain things like antibiotics and whatnot in the use of raising cattle. So could we have anticipated it? I think probably. Could we have gotten a better result? I don't know. Given how bad the result was for the sector, did we give up things in other areas that maybe we didn't have to? Maybe. I think this is a question for the government in terms of, are they satisfied with the outcome that they got? But going back to what I was saying about the CETA committees, there is still dispute settlement. If Canada has an issue with any of these matters in the European Union, they can take it to dispute settlement. They can take it to the committees. There's diplomatic cost to that, and obviously factor into any decision. But it's not like we don't have options in the CETA to raise these matters. And I would say, if you look at some of the CETA committee work, that's all Canada talks about at the Agriculture Committee and the SPS Committee is beef, right? So it's not like Canada's not bringing this up again and again. We don't get a lot of information about those committees, though, and maybe there is a bigger role that this Trade Committee, can play in, peering into some of those meetings that are happening at the bilateral level. But you might find some answers there, for example, about what's happening. Yeah.
Monsieur Donardi.
Mr. Donardi?
Madam Chair, so I'm not going to pretend to be a trade expert in these areas, but what I will say is what I did hear as negotiations going forth. Under the Conservative government, the CETA was started. My understanding, it was concluded by the Liberal government, the government of the day, and no partisan either way. This is not the point. But what I can tell you is, if the Europeans are not, holding their commitment or living up to the commitment of importing our beef, or perhaps even pork, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the product that they want? It's supposed to be a customer-driven system, right? Customer base. So if you don't have something they want today, then at least the market is there. You need to create something that they want. It's a supply and demand. It's a very simple thing. This is very basic economics. So it's no use to give or try to sell the Europeans something they don't want. Now, with regards to cheese, I will tell you, I can speak a little bit about this. With regards to cheese, I can tell you at the onset, when the manufacturers in Europe found out that the manufacturers in Canada, the biggest oligopolies, some of them in the world as far as dairies are concerned, and they were going to get licensed, they had a cow, pardon the pun. They were very upset. I know this because I have a lot of manufacturers that I deal with. This was not the spirit on the table. This was a last-second, oh, gotcha sort of thing. By the way, the manufacturers are getting 50%. And why would you say that? How would you like to sell to your competitor in a different market? You don't want to be doing that. You want the broad breadth and depth of a marketplace to go find a whole vast array of different customers and not be dependent on the big oligopolies that control 80% of the milk in this country. So they have something that we want, or they have something that we want, which is fine cheeses for the most part out of Europe. And if we have to give back them something, it's up to us to decide what is good as far as beef or pork is concerned. They're the customer, right? But I can tell you, as far as we didn't play exactly the fair ball either, if this is where we're going with this type of thing. They were shocked. They capitulated, but they were shocked. I know this for a fact. I hope I've answered your question.
The time is up. I've been trying to make sure that the witnesses had an opportunity to ensure the translation was clear. Mr. Cannings, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you for everyone for being here before us today. It's all very interesting and somewhat complicated. I'm kind of new on this file, so I'm learning a lot. I want to start with Mr. Volpe to try to figure out exactly what the auto parts manufacturers want, and it sort of plays into what Mr. Donardi just said about, producing something the customer wants. I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't have any cars or even, I assume, parts even here in Canada from Japan. Then we had a crisis with gas prices, and suddenly, Toyota, Nissan, Honda were making small gas, fuel-efficient cars that were very, very popular in the 70s. And it seems to me from my uneducated eye that they used that beachhead to develop a broad impact into the North American market. And it seems that you consider it a non-tariff barrier that because we produce big, heavy cars that aren't fuel efficient, we are being cheated somehow by the Japanese. These are non-tariff barriers. And I assume, yes, they are non-tariff barriers, but, perhaps we should be looking at that and making something the Japanese market wants. It's like California, doubling down on emission standards in the 70s because of smog. They made those standards, and the North American market capitulated because California was a big customer. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, and maybe I'm off base, but I'm trying to understand this.
Well, thank you to the honorable member for dating himself here. When I was a kid, there were big cars here, and the big cars were American, and the smaller cars were Japanese, and the Japanese took proper full advantage of a hole in the market for what we needed, especially with the spiking price of fuel. We use the Japanese, or we can use the Europeans. The way that they develop vehicle standards, size and fuel standards, are in part because of the cost of fuel, also in part because of the size of the roads in those markets. In Europe, there is a displacement charge that starts at 2 liters of displacement. If you go to Europe for whatever reason and you rent a car, you'll notice that almost everything starts as 2 liters or under, and everything else is a luxury tax that gets borne by the owner every year. It isn't. There's. I won't tread over the criticism that we should make things that are more attractive to the Europeans and the Japanese. I don't know if I agree or disagree. Those are certainly arguments that have been made over the years. The reason that those products are made that way are because of the way the roads are, the price of fuel, and the reason that we have bigger cars here is that we've had cheaper fuel and bigger roads. What I'm merely saying is that the position of our organization, certainly domestic producers here, is be awake to that when you make trade negotiations and say, oh, well, we've got access to the European market, or we got access to the Japanese market, in spite of the fact that a lot of what's happening in automotive is global platforms, designing to a more homogeneous customer preferences. The realities of what their production is geared towards. The Japanese have a market of 5 million vehicles a year, but they make 9 million. They need to export. In Canada, we make 2 million cars a year. We buy 2 million cars a year. It's a balance. They got the better deal in TPP. We didn't make a free trade arrangement with CETA. There was a quota there, but certainly I would have been saying the same thing if we had conceded local content requirements without in exchange the reduction of, or at least the addressing of non-tariff barriers. We don't make decisions in Toronto or Ottawa or Calgary, Montreal or Vancouver on what those cars look like. In this country, we supply the decisions made by Detroit or Tokyo, and now increasingly the Germans. So where Canadian interests don't control the design and engineering and size of vehicles, and Japanese interests do, they have a much stronger hand. The Europeans have a much stronger hand. The Koreans have a much stronger hand. And in the trade agreements we made with each of those regions, we lowered the domestic content requirement to sell a car tariff-free, and we did not address the barriers to entry. It wasn't a death knell in any way for Canadian market, but it did concede a whole bunch of market space to imports. And now we have EV mandates that are proposed and certainly will be confirmed this year that require a certain amount of domestic sales in Canada at a percentage to be EVs or those companies face a $20,000 fine for each vehicle that is not compliant. Well, a lot of those companies are from TPP countries or CETA countries that will meet those targets by importing vehicles to sell to Canadians because it's easier than to easier and more profitable than to do a short production run here and have Canadians build them and have Canadian part suppliers supply them. So, we need to be careful. I mean, at least we need to be informed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. I'd like to begin with Mr. Denardi, if I could. You talk about, the trade agreements that have been reached, CETA, WTO, CETA, TPP, CUSMA as well. And under those agreements, if I understand correctly, Canada's agreed, combined about a 10% market access when all those agreements are fully implemented. And so it's not so much the argument deals with what the market access is, it's how that quota is then distributed to the manufacturers and the producers. In my understanding, if you've raised the concerns, is that you've got these large producers or manufacturers in Canada that have operations in the United States, in Europe. They're international. They're actually getting double advantage from these agreements, leaving small producers such as yourself out in the cold. And you've talked to the government. You've raised these concerns. You've asked for changes, and you've spoken to Global Affairs. You've spoken to the Minister's office. You've written to them. What have their responses been to you? What actions are they taking to address these concerns that small manufacturers, because as you know, in my community itself, I've got a manufacturer, a small producer, Roman cheese products that sells lasagnas, gnocchis, ricotta cheeses throughout the country as well. So how do you respond to that?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. First of all, we're in the kind of the distributor class, but just want to just organize that. But still, the small side of stuff. Yes, manufacturers versus distributors, and yes, the very large manufacturers. So the large manufacturers are an oligopoly in this country. There's no question. The biggest dairy processors who get most of, on the CUSMA and the TTP side, the lion's share of everything. They are entitled to import quota, and so are the distributors. But it works on volume. So Mondo Foods, if I sell 1 million kilos of product, my combined volume, and someone like the very largest manufacturers, sell hundreds and hundreds of millions of kilos, they get the 99.9%, and I get the 0.1%. That's how it works on CUSMA, which has changed. It used to be an 80-20 rule, but Canada dug its heels in, and they changed the agreements, and now we're going to fight with the United States, and I don't know how that's going to end, but we'll see how that goes, The same thing is with the TTP is still intact in that there is some sharing between the manufacturers and the distributors. Those pools, it's just manufacturers and distributors. The CETA is a different thing. The CETA is the coveted one, right? The coveted one because it's European cheese. It's always been coveted and wanted in this Canada by many, many people. It's got a high demand. Initially, it was only supposed to be distributors and retailers. There's lots and lots of studies. I go to the 1992 an inquiry into the allocation of import quotas tabled in Parliament in 1992. We're talking about it since then. I appeared here. Yes, we did. Talking about the fair allocation, how it should be. But they got 50% of everything. So Mondo Foods, this whole threshold thing, it's one set of rules for the manufacturers between the large and the small, and I'm not begrudging them. But there is a completely different set of rules for the distributors, like myself and the retailers. In this moving target, not knowing where you're going to be from year to year has killed my business, as I've testified. What does Global Affairs say all to get here? They won't talk to me anymore, not the senior staff. There's been many emails upon emails, conversations that started off very, very nice. So either they're incapable or they're indifferent. It's one of the two. Incapable because they don't have the power to do it, or they're just indifferent and they just don't care. As a matter of fact, I'm going to recite a line that the people at Global Affairs told to me. This is the senior management. Tom, there are winners and losers in this game, and you're on the wrong side of the fence. Well, tell that to the bank to pay the mortgage after you get. I've just built a business. unacceptable. And they won't talk to me. They won't correspond with me. Neither the director, the deputy director, the senior policy trade analyst. And I've been part of their solutions for so many years. They've come to me so often to participate in their studies. Madam Chair.
That is totally disappointing to hear. And as our leader likes to say, I mean, on this side, we should be the servants, not the masters. And we should be listening to the input of all those businesses that exist here in Canada and what's better for our sector. And there needs to be changes on this end with regards to how that quota is allocated. We've had before at this committee an organization called Tree of Life, and they bring in specialty creams from the UK for high tea and so on. And they said, as such, for nearly 2-year period, Tree of Life was unable to bring cream into the Canadian market despite there being no domestic supply, which came at the expense of our thousands of customers, right? I mean, how does that happen? If there's no domestic supply, how is it that they're not able to get quota to bring that in to service the market, to maintain their business so that they continue to exist? There needs to be some changes here. And have you spoken to the minister directly on this? Have you asked to speak with her office?
Madam Chair, I would love to speak to the minister directly. I absolutely invite that. I would fly to Ottawa from the Northwest Territories to speak to our minister. I would just, if I may, Madam Chair, I would be happy if they would just go back to more or less how CETA allocations, the threshold started.
So we're not talking about access here. It's about the allocation.
Mr. Miao, please, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, all the witnesses, for being here today. And I think I will just keep it very simple here, because trade is very important, not just to any country, but to Canada as well. And we hear problem, and I know Mr. Nardi, you mentioned a few. I think I'd like to open this question to all the witnesses on the floor. What do each of you see as the top problem in our current non-tariff trade barrier in existing trade agreement? And what kind of suggestion or recommendation each of you suggests to us as a committee to take in consideration for any future negotiation with these agreements? Maybe I can start with Ms. Bradbury.
Top problem. Top problem.
And I'd like to ask if you can keep it to a minute so everyone has a chance.
Right.
Thank you.
Women, of course, are 51% of the population. Women are found everywhere. Women are top consumers, right? And global studies have found that women spend 90% of their domestic income, or their personal income, should I say, on allocating to their household, their children, their home, that kind of thing. While men, according to this study, allocate 35% of their revenues. So women play a very important role in society and in the economy. Anything we can do to make it easier for women to be either workers, employees, or hopefully go up the value chain would help. I mentioned earlier the initiatives at the international level with the Intellectual Property Organization, working closer with there. So working in partnership, I think, is the solution. All of the non-tariff barriers are very onerous. And so any solutions that come through with partnerships, also large corporations. Some large corporations get it, just like Mary Ng's major strategy gets it. Large corporations, I could explain later. Wait for my next question, I guess.
Thank you. And Ms. Demonardi, please.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think the top problem is that the allocations, as far as the agreements are concerned, are heavily weighted towards the very largest players in the industry. Okay, that's the top problem. And the solution is you need to keep to what I think the spirit of those negotiations were about. And if you have a set of rules, the solution is if you have a set of rules, you have to stay pretty close to what these set of rules were at the beginning. And we've changed them or let them drift a couple of times now.
Thank you. And Mr. Chu?
Okay, thanks for the question. I guess in keeping with the spirit of my presentation, I would just say, I can't think of one worst or most important NTB that Canada should be focused on right now. I think they all relate to very specific contexts and very specific sectors, and they should be dealt with that way. I think, to me, one of the problems of Canadian trade policy is it tries to deal with all these very complicated, specific issues with one hammer approach, which is, let's just make the technical barriers to trade chapters stricter and stricter and stricter on government and hope that has an effect. And the history shows it hasn't had an effect, because all these issues we're talking about are decades-old issues that no Canadian trade agreement has been able to solve so far. So I think different solutions are needed, is what I would say. But if I could say one, and you've already dealt with this, it would probably be U.S. trade remedies law, right? I mean, and that's a different topic that I know the committee's already dealt with.
Well, thank you. And over to you online, Mr. Philoppi.
Sure. I would just say one thing. I think that we need to recognize that industrial policy in new regions makes surprise players possible that will take our market share if we don't have, and without a reciprocal upside. I talked about the Vietnamese, but who would have known 5 years ago that Turkey would have had a company called TOG that is going to sell vehicles around the world. And unless we have a domestic car maker, I think we need to approach trade agreements, current and future ones, with countries that have domestic car makers a little more thoughtfully.
Okay. Thank you very much. Madame Brioya.
Ms. Vignola. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Quickly, I just want to confirm that I understood well and summed it up well in my mind, Mr. DiNardi, what you said to me earlier. If I understood correctly, Canada was, as a negotiator, either naive, a bad negotiator that botched the analysis of the impacts just before signing, or a bad analyst of the markets that they were hoping to reach, or all three of those answers. So is my analysis correct, or am I simplifying too much?
Madam Chair, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question. I am simply saying, and I don't think I'm going to give you the answer that you want. I would just simply say that that in any market, you have to understand what the customer wants. And if the Canadian negotiators at the time didn't understand the type of beef or pork that the Europeans wanted, well, I suppose they didn't do their homework. I would suggest to you, may I touch on something from before? I would like to tell you that the New Zealanders, the TTP countries, are equally as disappointed in the draw of a lot of the products that they signed on for. Moz, cheddar, the allocation that we gave them, it's never been filled. There's literally hundreds of thousands of kilograms at the end of the year. And I'm sure they're just as disappointed and probably asking themselves the exact same question as you've just asked me now. I don't know if I've answered it enough for you. I'm sorry. I cannot be more specific, but
Well, I thank you very much. You are answering me. We have homework to do, or we have to improve our performance clearly for our producers and manufacturers as much as for our distributors. Is that a better summary?
Yeah. Merci encore pour la question. I think, yeah, just to say, I don't know either, the answer to that question. I think you've got a bunch of answers, and they all sound like they could make sense. Just to reiterate, too, there are consumer preferences involved here as well. That the Europeans know what kind of beef they like and they don't like, the production methods they like and they don't like. This has very much to do with consumer preferences, maybe more than perhaps Canadian negotiating strategy and tactics, right? So power is also at play here. I mean, we're a much smaller country than the EU.
I think you all did a very good job with answering those questions. Mr. Cannings, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll just go back to Mr. Donardi briefly, just because of what you were saying about New Zealand and cheddar allocations, just so I can understand what they're upset about and why. Is it something to do with their negotiations, or is it just the way we're acting? That's where I was confused.
Madam Chair, so every country went in with the best of good faith in the negotiations in these agreements. And New Zealand Canada agreed to give the New Zealanders, or pardon me, the TTP countries, I need to clarify that, a certain access to our market for product like Moz, mozzarella, right, and cheddar, and butter, and this sort of thing. And that quota is never filled. We never bring in the Canadian consumers, or probably the manufacturers, distributors, everyone who's got that quota. It's available. You can get as much as you want. But our market, for whatever reason, we're not digging it. You know, the consumer, whether it's hard to work with or whatever it is, there's something about the product that's not that our marketplace does not appreciate. So there's a lot of quota left over every single year that is not filled. And I'm sure the TTP countries, in particular New Zealand, is saying, oh, but I came into this negotiation thinking that you would take all of this cheese, because look at the access you gave me, and it's not being used. So they may be feeling somewhat what maybe the Canadians are feeling on the beef side of things. This was my only point. Have I made that?
I guess so. I just wondered why that isn't happening. Is the price not right? Or, I mean, I go to New Zealand regularly and the cheese tastes great.
Yeah, it could be for a number of reasons. Price probably wouldn't be dealing with it. Pricing is an issue. New Zealand is a commodity player. They produce some of the lowest low-cost quality product in the world. It comes across, some of it's frozen, doesn't quite react the same. And sometimes it's price, and sometimes it's just spending a lot of time on the ship and maybe frozen and thawed, and it's just not living up to the standards.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Seaback for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to actually ask some questions first to Mr. Volpe. Mr. Kingston came to the committee to talk about autos, obviously. And one of the things I'm curious about is, would disunity in regulations constitute a non-tariff barrier? And the example that Mr. Kingston gave is that he said we must maintain regulatory alignment with the United States, because that's where most of our autos go for export. And he was talking about Canadian EV standards, clean fuel standards, somewhat decoupling from tailpipe emission standard regulations in the United States. I don't know if if you know a lot about that or not, or if this is an emerging potential non-tariff barrier that we have with our largest trading partner.
Thanks for the question. And Brian and I coordinate on this because I think we all have the same interest. It is extremely important for regulatory alignment in automotive, 100% regulatory alignment in automotive with Washington. I say Washington because sometimes what we do is we look at Sacramento.
Right.
And we say, we like what's happening with California Air Resources Board. We think it's a little bit more aggressive, and they appear to be putting together a coalition of states that represent about 40% of the market, and it's the highest standard, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't make, so we all work in a business. Automotive cars and parts work in a single-digit EBITDA world, and that's by making one vehicle platform and one type of parts for one configuration to sell all over North America. And while it may be attractive to create a bit of an island so that you could tell a narrative in Canada, a leadership narrative, noble as it is, it does put Canadian manufacturing at a disadvantage, because what will happen What we've seen happen specifically is companies will either have to create a subnational jurisdiction only product,
Right.
or they'll pull the product.
So do we seem to be aligning a little bit more with Sacramento than with Washington? Is that the sense that you're sort of hinting at a little bit?
We're leaning that way, and
Yeah.
we've warned not to, because I think it'll hurt our manufacturing footprint.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Dinardi, just wanted to say, do you have it seems to me that with respect for cheese importers, that the non-tariff barrier is being created by the government of Canada in how they're allocating how TRQs come into the country, as it's all going to producers, and how you move around is non-transparent. What would you say would be the solution to that here in Canada? How would we fix this to create certainty for importers like yourselves and all the other importers across the country?
Thank you, and Madam Chair, through you. With regards to CETA, without blowing the whole system up and taking manufacturers completely out of the equation, let's just say we stay where we are at the moment. At least going back to a set of rules that we consider to be fair and equitable. You had a set of rules with regards to large and small pools. They're moving around due to an unintended consequences. I think we just really need to go back to where the spirit of it was at the very beginning. That would certainly, and make it transparent. So a company like mine, if you know that the threshold's around 1 million kilos, you make the decision as a business owner. It's in your hands, whether you're going to sell more and then lose that quota, that's up to you, or you're going to stay below that. Don't sell as much, maybe charge a bit more, make more money, and have that quota for yourself. That's what I would say. Right now, my business is in the hands of global affairs. Somehow it doesn't make sense. It never makes any, it's never a good thing when the government of Canada is running your business. As far as the other categories are concerned, I think you have to adopt something similar to what you did with CETA, if that's the way we want to keep this, where there's a split, there's a share between distributors and manufacturers, if indeed that's the road we want to go down there. Right now, it's very heavily advantaged towards the manufacturers, as I pointed out before. Heavily. Thank you.
And would you suggest that it would be more equitable if it was a more equitable distribution?
Yes, equitable distribution, yes, between distributors and manufacturers. 50-50. You throw the retailers in there too if you want.
And what's the allocation right now?
Sorry, Madam Chair, in which category, please, sir?
Sorry, with respect to the importation, how much are the producers getting? How much are the importers getting?
Okay, I'll try. So with regards to CETA, they're different for each of them. So with regards to CETA, 50% goes to manufacturers and 50% goes to distributors and retailers, of which there's 4 pools, and I expressed what happened to me with going from the small to large pool. So that's got to be fixed. That's got to be reorganized, this unintended consequence. The other 2 categories, and so the first category is just 3 players: manufacturers, 50%, distributors and retailers, in another category, 50%. CETA. CUSMA, distributors and manufacturers only, no retailers. And that's all. Right now, CUSMA is the more you sell, the more you get. So Mondo Foods gets nothing because, relatively speaking, to those massive dairies, to the dairies who pump millions of liters of milk through, they get everything. We get nothing. And the same TTP, a little bit different. There is a mechanism there whereby there's a share. So if you apply and you're a distributor, you get a 1-piece fair share based on the number of applicants you get. It's not terrible. It's not the best, but it's not terrible. And that's for both butter and cheese.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you off at all. I hope you got your points across. On to Mr. Arya, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Mr. Dinardi. I know this study is about the trade barriers, non-tariff trade barriers in international agreements. Quickly, I want to know what is the status of trade barriers within Canada while trading between provinces. Is there any big issue you face there?
With regards to imports, no.
No. With regards to trade between, say, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, within Canada.
Well, I mean, you know that we have supply management in this country, sir, right? And that every province has a certain slug of milk, if you will. Most of that milk is concentrated in Quebec and Ontario, then BC, and then Alberta, and the prairies practically have nothing as far as domestic milk production is concerned. I think milk for, you know, where the farmers are, and by the way, my father was a farmer, so I support farmers. Okay, it's just I don't know if I answered the question, but that's
okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Ms. Bradbury. Whenever the non-tariff barriers were there, I don't know which countries you worked as a trade commissioner. Which is the best way to deal with that? Through the dispute mechanisms available in the free trade agreements, or through direct negotiations, say at the ministerial level? What is the best way to address those things?
Well, non-tariff barriers, as my colleague Stuart was saying, there's positive aspects of these NTBs and there's less positive aspects. So it's, in a lot of the ways, it's best to work within the system. So intellectual property rights, it's best to work within the system to help smaller producers, indigenous producers, et cetera, learn how the system works and to make it work to their benefit. So counterfeit, for example, is a huge problem. It's now up to 2 to 3% of international trade, which is pretty incredible, really. And that affects a lot of indigenous producers. So by working within the system, you can make it work to your benefit. So I wouldn't say that. I don't want to get into the whole argument about.
Thank you. Next question, Madam Chair, is to Mr. Volpe. You mentioned the barriers we face in Japan and Vietnam. Are those barriers common to all countries exporting to Japan and Vietnam for the same products? Say whether the export is from Canada to Japan and from US to Japan?
No, but there is a mix. European regulations look a little bit like the Japanese ones, and then you'll see a lot of product similarities between what sells, what's built and sold in Europe is a little bit more akin to what sells in Japan. But yeah, for the other major, the same between Korea and Japan. But for North American markets, origins from any of the 3 North American countries, it's the same non-tariff barrier.
When battling this non-tariff barriers, again, the same question is whether the dispute mechanisms available in the agreements is the best way, or direct interaction with the governments concerned, which is the best way to deal with them?
I mean, in the CPTPP, there is no mechanism, and when we finally signed it, I mean, it was negotiated under one government and signed under the other. We said there were side letters. I said those side letters were worthless then. It really hasn't changed now. We just got to be smarter.
Okay, and my question to Mr. Stew is that the same thing, that whenever countries bring in some non-tariff barriers, it may that they may apply to all export into that country, all imports into that country from different exporters. Is it best to join hands with other similar countries and address that, or is it one-on-one, say Canadian export gets barriers, one say selling to Japan or some other country, a bilateral mechanism of dealing with it is the best?
Case by case, I'm assuming. In some instances, it does make a lot of sense to go through the WTO. I mean, I mentioned the notice process at the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. Frequently, countries will band together when there's a measure introduced somewhere else that they don't like. Exporters in common, for example. But some cases, it makes a lot of sense to do it bilaterally, where you want to keep things more trusting kind of thing, and then maybe the Canada-US or Canada-Mexico context, for example.
Thank you for the witnesses. Mr. DiNardi, I cut you off because it had gone over the time, but if you want to finish that third point you were going to make, I'll pass the minute over to you.
I believe it had to do with trade barriers across the country. The only point is that that we have supply management in this country, and we're not getting rid of it anytime soon, I would suspect. Too many dairy farmers across the country, small farms. But what I'd like to point out is that you have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of dairy farms across the country, but you have very, very few manufacturers. Less than 50. And 80% of that milk is controlled by 3 or 4 companies.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much to all of the witnesses. We will suspend because we have to go in camera, but thank you very much, and we very much appreciated your testimony from all 3 of you. Suspend.
Thank you.
Bye.